yourself in a while. And so the idea of free will, to what extent do they determine their own destiny, is a related and an equally important concept. So we're going to deal with two topics tonight. Then we're going to start dealing with what happens in Isfahan at the home of the host of the Bab, where he stays for 40 days. And interestingly, you probably have heard this story, but he tells his host that in 40 days, his host is going to die. And sure enough, he does. Now, that's not the nicest thing to hear from a guest, but in this case, it had a very spiritual significance. So let me go to the PowerPoint and start with the first years of the Bab's ministry, part 2. We dealt part 1 last time. Next week is going to be the most important program we've done. So if you can't attend it, you might want to see a recording of it. It's going to deal with my overview of what Baha'i scholarship is about, what it's not about. And I'm going to share with you some resources, some of which I've only recently come across myself. It's amazing how much there is that's already been done. Any Baha'i researcher in these days is standing on the shoulders of really incredible people who've gone before. Hassan Balyuzi obviously being one of the first of these, Mirza Abul Fazl being an even earlier one. Well, I will not only show you where those resources are, but where they are. But one of the amazing things that that Lucia and I discovered in looking at those this week was that the Baha'u'llah wrote there over 1,160, 11,000 it is. I re-looked it up, Lucia. It's 11,600 works. So when we say, as we're accustomed to doing, when we tell other people about the Baha'i faith, that Baha'u'llah wrote over 100 works, well over 100 works. And the same thing is true with the Bab, who wrote, I think it was 6,000 works. I'm not sure. I'll look at that for next week. So we left off last time. The Bab had been sent to Shiraz, or actually he went by foot to Shiraz, where he was met en route by soldiers to take him prisoner to Shiraz, where he was arrested and was berated by the governor of Shiraz, publicly interrogated, struck in the face. This is from last time. And so July through November, a number of things happen, which we won't get into tonight, but you need to be aware of what's happening simultaneous to the Bab's journey northward, presumably, hopefully to Tehran to meet with the Shah. But as we know, he becomes diverted purposefully by the Grand Vizier. The story of Vahid and his interrogation of the Bab, or his 3 meetings with the Bab. We did already go over that story, and the brief account of how Hujat became a Baha'i or Babi instantly upon reading 1 page of the Qayyum al-Asma. And then the story of Tahireh, which has been done so well by so many people. One of the first was a book by Martha Root called Tahireh the Pure, which is available online if you can't get the book. Almost everything's available online now, so don't be troubled if you can't find some source. They're being collected, and this is one of the things I wanted to show you next week. So lots of people have told the story of Tahireh. My co-author, Amala Himat, and I, as I've told you before, have written 3 books so far, just translating her poetry, though we do get into her life and under what circumstances she wrote her poetry. And we are currently working on a 4th volume because another manuscript of hers has been located. Needless to say, it had already been located, but we didn't know it had been located. So in September, the Bab departs for Isfahan after being in Shiraz less than 15 months. And then February through March of the following year, in other words, about 5 months later, the Bab stays in Isfahan for 40 days at the home of Manachir Khan. The Shah orders the Bab to be sent secretly to Tehran to meet with him. Now, this is why this is such an important event in what happens in Isfahan.
And Dr. Hatcher, let me interrupt you here. If
Yes.
we're not able to see the slides, if you wouldn't mind resharing.
Oh, I'm sorry. There's a good reason for that. I didn't share it. Let me go back to the beginning where it says I can share and share screen. Thank you, Alex. I'm sorry. All right, now start from current slide. Let's see where we are. All right. Let's see where we were here and if I've gotten too far ahead. So let's see. He goes from Shiraz to Isfahan. Let's see. So we've gotten there, interrogated guy. Okay. The reason this is so important to stay in Isfahan is because it is here that he accrues such an incredible following, as the manifestations do wherever they go. They are like magnets, spiritual magnets, not only in their spiritual knowledge, but just as sources of spiritual power. People are drawn to them. It's interesting, though, in the stories of the manifestations that they can be in front of one person and this person will melt by being overwhelmed by the Holy Spirit. Someone else who's not receptive or attentive, nothing. They're just ordinary people to them. That's particularly interesting, something that you need to consider. Especially when you share the faith with your friends and with others. Some are receptive, some are ready, some are not. So the Bab spends 3 nights in Kashan, where he dreams of Haji Mirza Jani. Bab arrives at the fortress of Kengerd, only 28 miles from Tehran. We've been over this. Then he goes to Kulain, which is even closer, to await further instructions. He stays there for 20 days. And so, but it's in Isfahan that we're concerned. So let me skip through this, where he ultimately goes to Maku, the open mountain where he is kept for 9 months. It is during this time that the Bab reveals some of his most important works, particularly the Persian Bayan, which is the book of laws, the mother book of the Baha'i faith. So in Isfahan, this is the route that chronology just discussed. But in Isfahan, at the home of Manachir Khan, we hear the story of how the Grand Vizier deters the visit of the Bab with the Shah, who wants to see him, why he's interested in this. What is, remember, he's already at this point sent Vahid, his most trusted, learned cleric or divine that he is aware of, who's well known throughout Persia, to interview the Bab and presumably to destroy his claims of being the return of the hidden Imam, the Qaim, the Mahdi, and so on. So he's curious, and he would have met with him, no doubt, had it not been for the interference of the Grand Vizier. So here's a brief account from, it's not particularly brief, but pretty brief, from, this is not from Nabil, but rather the Guardian's summary of it in God Passes By. He was ceremoniously received, and such was the spell he cast over the people of that city, that on one occasion, after his return from the public bath, an eager multitude clamored for the water that had been used for his ablutions. Now, this doesn't mean the water he bathed in, but his ablutions, that's the water you use, of course, when you wash your face and your hands in preparation for prayer. So magic was his charm that his host, forgetful of the dignity of his high rank, his own high rank, in other words, was wont to wait personally upon him. It was at the request of the same prelate that the Bab one night after supper revealed his well-known commentary on the Surah of Al-Asr. Writing with astonishing rapidity, he in a few hours had devoted to the exposition of the significance of only the first letter of that surah, a letter which Sheikh Ahmad Aksai had stressed and which Baha'u'llah refers to in the Kitabi Agdas, verses that equaled in number a third of the Quran, a feat that called forth such an outburst of reverent astonishment from those who witnessed it, that they arose and kissed the hem of his robe. Again, this isn't myth. These aren't antiquated stories. These are verified by those who saw it. So imagine that, a third the length of the Quran in a few hours. The tumultuous enthusiasm of the people of Isfahan was meanwhile visibly increasing. Crowds of people, some impelled by curiosity, others eager to discover the truth, still others anxious to be healed of their infirmities, flocked from every quarter of the city to the house of the Imam Jumi. The wise and judicious Manachir Khan could not resist the temptation of visiting so strange, so intriguing a personage. Before a brilliant assemblage of the most accomplished divines, he, a Georgian, and that's not, of course, this is Georgia in near Azerbaijan, by origin and not in the south of the United States, and a Christian by birth, requested the Bab to expound and demonstrate the truth of Muhammad's specific mission. And of course, that means in the Abrahamic line of prophets, what was Muhammad's specific purpose, as opposed to those who went before him. To this request, which those present had felt compelled to decline, the Bab readily responded. In less than 2 hours, and in the space of 50 pages, he had not only revealed a minute and vigorous and original dissertation on this noble theme, but had also linked it with both the coming of the Qaim and the return of the Imam Hussein, an exposition that prompted Manachir Khan to declare before that gathering his faith in the Prophet of Islam, and he was a Christian, remember, as well as his recognition of the supernatural gifts with which the author of so convincing a treatise was endowed. Now, the Imam Hussein that's mentioned here is, of course, the coming of Baha'u'llah, who is supposedly the return of the Imam Hussein, in addition to everything else. These evidences of the growing ascendancy exercised by an unlearned youth on the governor and the people of a city rightly regarded as one of the strongholds of Shia Islam alarmed the ecclesiastical authorities. Now remember here, it says unlearned. We hear the same thing about Muhammad. He was unlearned, that he was untutored, that he was illiterate, so on. That's not what is meant. It meant that he had no formal education under the tutelage of famous learned scholars that were acceptable in the site. Of course, he had attended the classes of Sayyid Kazim, but not to learn from him, but to observe. Refraining from any act of open hostility, which they knew full well would defeat their purpose, they sought by encouraging the circulation of the wildest rumors to induce the Grand Vizier of the Shah to save a situation that was growing hourly more acute and menacing. In other words, he was winning a following and winning the hearts and minds of these people. The popularity enjoyed by the Bab, his personal prestige, and the honors accorded him by his countrymen have now reached their high watermark. And of course, this is just in Isfahan, but it was also happening throughout the country as the letters of the living went about their task of teaching the faith. As I told you last time, the Baha'i, which was a building specified for the teaching of the Baha'i faith in Mashhad, in the most eastern part of Persia, was attracting all kinds of people, as was Tahirih in several cities, first in Baghdad and then in Karbala and Najaf and so on. You'll learn about that in the story of Tahirih. The shadows of an impending doom began to fast gather about him. A series of tragedies from then on followed in rapid sequence, destined to culminate in his own death and the apparent extinction of the influence of his faith, apparent. And of course, among those events would be the battle at Fort Tabarsi, when so many of the letters of the living were killed. After the Battle of Fort Tabarsi, Khodus is butchered in his own village. And you can imagine what effect that would have had. Or did it? Now, this is a question we're going to deal with a little bit tonight. Are they above the feelings that you and I feel, the manifestations? Are they impervious to the what Abdul Baha calls the changes and chances of this world? Well, let's see. So, again, I'm repeating this because that quote I just read talks about the totality of the rest of the journey, when he goes up to Maku, the open mountain where he stays for 9 months. The plenitude of other stories taking place during this same 30-year period. One is the sifter of wheat, which is a minor story, but I love it. It's when it's about Mullah Hussein teaching in this same city of Isfahan before the Bab got there, and how no one would became a believer in the Babi faith except a simple sifter of wheat. And I'm sure you've heard this phrase, the sifter of wheat. What does that mean? It has the same effect in my mind as does the blacksmith who converted, was responsible for the conversion of Mirza Abul Fazl. The story there, if you remember, is Mirza Abul Fazl, like Wahid, is a most learned Islamic scholar, revered by all the other clerics and divans. And he passed by the blacksmith, and they got in a conversation, and the blacksmith says, "Tell me, O learned one, is it true," and this is my own recollection, paraphrase, "is it true that a raindrop is accompanied, that every raindrop is accompanied by an angel according to tradition?" And Mirza Abul Fazl had to confess, yeah, there was such a tradition that said that. Yes, that's true. And then the blacksmith says, is it not also a tradition that God will never visit, or that angels will never visit, spirits will never visit a house with a dog in it, because dogs were considered dirty, filthy, and they were to stay outside. And Mirza Abul Fazl recalled that tradition and said, yes, that's true. So would it not also be true, then, said the blacksmith, that rain will never fall on a house that has a dog? Well, Mirza Abul Fazl, that didn't convert him to the Babi faith, but what converted him was the fact that this lowly blacksmith who was a Babi, or was a Baha'i rather. This is much later in the history of the faith. Uh, could in effect checkmate him mentally. And so he wanted to know how do you know this? What are you? And so on. And by that means, he became acquainted with the Baha'i faith and became one of the most learned. According to Abdul Baha'i, I think he was considered the most learned scholar in the Baha'i faith, but I'm not positive that that's stated. I recall it being said. The story of the Babiye, I mentioned, the story of Tahirih, which is being explored, and the importance of Tahirih carries on today as women in Iran look to her as not only as a woman of great knowledge and learning and a great poetess, but of course, because of her dying or words before she was executed, you may kill me as soon as you like, but you will never stop the emancipation of women. And so the women in Iran who are far from emancipated these days, they often use her in portrayals on plays and so forth. The activity throughout the realm I've just mentioned, and the rejection by the Sheikhis, and that is the Bab had sent one of the letters of the living specifically to go to the head of the Sheikhi movement, who had succeeded with several successions past the Sheikh Ahmad, who began the Sheikhi movement, and they said they wanted nothing to do with it. So the great irony here, people specifically trained to look for the coming of the Qaim and the Qayyum, and they didn't get it. They missed it. The shock, fear, jealousy, and hatred of the ulama and the clerics who worked in league with the government in a sort of codependency, as I put it. We've talked about this before, and it's talked about in great detail about the tenor of the governance in Shoghi Effendi's preface to or introduction to Nabil's narrative. So the free will of the manifestations. Then the end of the story in Isfahan is that at the end of 40 days, Manachir Khan does die. The Bab is then sent to the fortress and then to Kulain, and then instead of going up 20 miles or so to Tehran, the Grand Vizier convinces the Shah that it would be extremely dangerous for him to do so, that it in effect might even threaten his own supremacy as the monarch. Why doesn't the Bab go elsewhere? Why doesn't the Bab escape? Like Baha'u'llah, he has many opportunities to do so. Why do the manifestations simply follow the path that they are made to follow by the powers that be? Now, this is a wonderful map. There are several versions of this map, but it's particularly good because it literally has every place that Baha'u'llah ever spent any time, including the mountains of Suleymaniye in Kurdistan and so on. And I can't go in on it here, but I can here so that you can see that at the bottom here, it gives you the date where he was at any given point on the in his travels. And so I'm putting the now where did I go here? Let's see. Oh, here. I'm putting the URL, the link to that map on the slides for you, so you can look at that map. Though if you just put maps of the travels of Baha'u'llah on Google, you'll find this map. But it's a really wonderful one. There's another which I have that shows everything, or not everything, but the major works that Baha'u'llah wrote in each one of these places. Particularly like that one. So, free will in the manifestations. Do they have free will? If they do, why don't they use it to escape or go elsewhere? Now, some of you will probably recall that when the Baha'u'llah was in the Siachal, he was saved by virtue of the intercession, or partly because of the intercession of the Russian ambassador to Tehran. And indeed, the Russian ambassador invited him to Russia, and that he would be secure there and so on. Baha'u'llah did use his free will there, as I understand it and recall from the history, to say he chose a place that was near to his followers, his believers, and so he chose Baghdad, and left in the cold of winter after he was released and was in terrible health, and with Asiya Khanum and Abdul Baha went to to Baghdad on foot in the cold of winter, and they had to leave, as I recall, Mirza Mehdi behind because he was too young and in ill health. Though I may be thinking of Bahia Khanum. At any rate, some lovely stories about that. The manifestations are moved from place to place when they could contrive to use their influence to go somewhere else, which would be, or it seemed to be, more strategic and to their advantage, and to the advantage of the advancement of the faith. If they have immense power to do whatsoever they wish, why do they, that should be not rather than no, exercise? What propitious results can we discern in their following instead, to allowing themselves to be surrender, should be surrendered to the powers that be? Well, one answer that I propose, and these are my own propositions, not from any authoritative source, is that if they tried to be where they know would fulfill prophecy, it could be construed by historians and believers alike that they were, in effect, trying to fulfill those prophecies in order to prove their claim to be the prophesied manifestation. By allowing themselves to end up where they do, according to let Caesar, the things that are Caesar's belong to Caesar, and the things that are God belong to God, as Christ said, by allowing Caesar to the government powers to control where they go, no claim could be made that they designed. So we say, how did the Baha'is end up on that lovely mountain with at the Bay of Haifa, in this strategically important place that had been the cave, where the cave of Elijah had been, and where all the holy prophets talk about the nest of the prophets, as it's called in one writing. So that's one important reason that no one can claim that they contrive to fulfill the prophecies. They end up where they do, completely out of control of their own will. Secondly, it's another proof that they have no interest in temporal authority. And by that, I mean, they always claim, again, the Caesar quote by Christ, but Baha'u'llah repeatedly in his writings, but particularly in Epistle to the Son of the Wolf, he says over and over again how, see if we ever were anything but loyal citizens, that we've never tried to usurp your authority. He says this in his letters to the kings and rulers and so on. that they have no desire for temporal things or temporal authority. Now, you might go back and argue that, well, what about Muhammad? Didn't he take over these tribal villages and so forth? And you could say, yes, he had a kind of temporal authority, but as we talked about at length in studying Muhammad, he does that to impose law and order, if you want to use simple terms, or justice in a more philosophical mode of looking at the body politic and governance, but also to spread the religion of God, not that he himself should have authority. So what he sets up is a kind of republic, if you will, a representational government. Proof that they are dutiful citizens and faithful to the government, I just mentioned, that they render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's. Now, here's one proof of the point I'm trying to make. When Baha'u'llah returns from Suleymaniye, he doesn't do so of his own will. If you remember the accounts of what happens during the 2 year he has gone, the Baha'i faith, which he was then teaching, because the Babis were bereft of most of the writings of the Bab. So one of the first things he does during the 10 years he's in Baghdad is start immediately transcribing the teachings of the Bab. So before the Babis can recognize him whom God will make manifest, they've got to know the Bab predicted that there would be a manifestation, him whom God would make manifest. So in effect, he has to do the job that the Bab could not do because he was executed. And the Bab, in one letter, if you will recall, says that even though it is up to you, the letter to him whom God will make manifest, to do whatsoever you wish, for the sake of my loved ones, delay revealing yourself for 10 years or 9 years it is. And so he does. And during that 9 years, and for the sake of the loved ones of the Bab, he teaches them what it's like to be a Babi. And so when he leaves the Baghdad, he does so because anything he does to try to teach the Babis and the teachings of the Bab to them, the more his half-brother, Mirza Yahya Subi Azal, the more he claims that he's trying to usurp his authority. And that is, if you remember, Subi Azo, which means a title, means the morn of eternity, was designated by the Bab as his nominee. Now, what does a nominee mean? It means someone who was to take charge of and oversee the faith until him whom God make manifest shall appear. And so anything Baha'u'llah did, and the more he did to help out, the more Mirza Yahya could point and say, see, he's trying to take over my authority as nominee. And of course, eventually Mirza Yahya stepped up his claim not to be nominee, but to be him whom God would make manifest. So Baha'u'llah really had no choice. You can say this was a willful strategic thing, and yet, as you will see in the story we're about to read, it was not his intent to go away and say, okay, you want it here, you've got control, let's see what kind of job you do, though that's what happened. But the problem is he was in a bind. Anything he tried to do was perceived as, or made to be seen by Mirza Yahya as taking over his proper role, Mirza Yahya's role. And so he went to the mountains without telling anyone, not without saying, okay, well, then I'm going to leave. And it wasn't a threat or something. He simply took off without telling his family or anyone where he was going. And of course, dwelled among the Kurds, the Sufis in the monastery in Suleymaniye, after staying in the cave for a long while as he dwelled as a darvish. Lots of lovely stories there. So why did he return? He returns because even Mirza Yahya said, please, let's send someone to find him and to bring him back. And so at the encouragement of Abdul Baha and the family, they send Sheikh Sultan to, or is it Syed, Sheikh Sultan, to go to the mountains and find the one they had heard that might be him, Darvish Muhammad. Such was the audacity and effrontery of these demoralized. Now, this is describing what had happened to the Babis in the meantime. That no less than 25 persons, according to Abdul Baha's testimony, had the presumption to declare themselves to be the promised one foretold by the Bab. Such was the decline in their fortunes that they hardly dared show themselves in public. Kurds and Persians vied with each other when confronting them in the streets and heaping abuse upon them and in vilifying openly the cause which they proclaimed or professed. Such was the audacity and effrontery of these demoralized and misguided, I just read that. Little wonder that on his return to Baghdad, Baha'u'llah should have described the situation then existing in these words. We found no more than a handful of souls, faint and dispirited, nay, utterly lost and dead. The cause of God had ceased to be on anyone's lips, nor was any heart receptive to its message. Such was the sadness that overwhelmed him on his arrival that he refused for some time to leave his house except for visits to Kazimain and for his occasional meeting with a few of his friends who resided in the town and in Baghdad. The tragic situation that had developed in the course of his 2 years' absence now imperatively demanded his return. You know, I think I messed up there. Someone can help me. Maybe Alex, you can look up that quote for me in the meantime. I think that's describing when he first arrived in Baghdad from, as he walked over the mountains of Hamadan. Yeah, I'm almost positive that's true. So now we're beginning the situation that developed in the meantime. So forgive me, friends, I made yet another error. The tragic situation that had developed in the course of his 2 years' absence now imperatively demanded his return. From the mystic source, he himself explains in the Kitab-i-Gan, there came the summons bidding us return whence we came. Surrendering our will to his, we submitted to his injunction. By God, besides whom there is none other God, is his emphatic assertion to Sheikh Sultan, as reported by Nabil in his narrative. But for my recognition of the fact that the blessed cause of the primal point was on the verge of being completely obliterated, and all of the sacred blood poured out in the path of God would have been shed in vain, I would have in no wise consented to return to the people of the Bayan, and would have abandoned them to the worship of the idols their imaginations had fashioned. Now, the people of the Bayan henceforth, and especially in the Igan and afterwards, is a pejorative term, or at least it's nuanced by Baha'u'llah to mean those who are following the Bayan rather than following the what I am revealing. Not at this point necessarily, but later it will. So surrendering our will to his. So if it had been his will, he would not have gone. So this is a very clear, logical, axiomatic statement that his will was to do one thing, but it was the will of God that he return, and so he submitted to the will of God. This is the axiom I'm trying to point out, that yes, they have free will. I've even wondered if perhaps they have free will in their pre-existent life when it's time for them to go, and they are aware of each other, and says, maybe one says to the other, well, it's your turn, good luck. I wonder if any one of them ever chose, no, I'd rather not. I'd just as soon stay here in the realm of the spirit. A thought, probably not a very good one. So this is very much parallel, of course, to the words of Christ. This is a quote from the scriptures. And he, Christ, was withdrawn from them being the apostles, the night before he is arrested, about a stone's cast, and kneeled down and prayed, saying, Father, if thou be willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done. And there appeared an angel unto him from heaven, strengthening him. And being in an agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was, as it were, great drops of blood falling down to the ground. One thing that's always interested me about this particular event is, how do we know this? The same thing about Christ going into the wilderness and his war with Satan. Of course, we discussed that as metaphorical, but nevertheless, Christ was by himself. How do we know this story? Well, it has to be that he shared it with his followers at some point. They do feel pain and loss, I believe, and I would even say that's a guess on my part. No sooner had the prince freed them. Now, who is them? He's talking about the prisoners who survived the battle at Fort Sheikh Tabarsi. And here he's particularly this is referring to Qudus. And so these things come one after another. This is in 1848, the fall of 1848 through the spring of 1849, that the 9-month battle of Tabarsi occurs. So of course the authorities say, if swear on the Quran that if they will be if they will put down their arms and come out, they will be allowed to go free. But they captured them. Acting under orders from the Sayyidul Ulama, arose to perpetrate upon the body of their victims acts of such atrocious cruelty as no pen can describe. By the testimony of Baha'u'llah, that heroic youth, and the heroic youth here is Qudus, who was still on the threshold of his life, was subjected to such tortures and suffered such a death as even Jesus had not faced in the hour of his greatest agony. Such were its circumstances that the Bab, who was then confined in the castle of Shiraz, was unable for a period of 6 months either to write or to dictate. The deep grief which he felt had stilled the voice of revelation and silenced his pen. How deeply he mourned his loss. What cries of anguish he must have uttered as the tale of the siege, the untold sufferings, the shameless betrayal, and the wholesale massacre of the companions of Sheikh Tabarsi reached his ears and was unfolded before his eyes. What pangs of sorrow he must have felt when he learned of the shameful treatment which his beloved Qudus had undergone in his hour of martyrdom at the hands of the people of Barfarouche. How he was stripped of his clothes, how the turban which he had bestowed upon him had been befouled, how barefooted, bareheaded, and loaded with chains he was paraded through the streets, followed and scorned by the entire population of the town, how he was execrated and spat upon by the howling mob, how he was assailed with the knives and axes of the scum of its female inhabitants, how his body was pierced and mutilated, and how eventually it was delivered to the flames. Well, Uh, that's the end of my exposition of, brief as it is, of my own belief and theory. And of course, we also have testimony of how grief-stricken was Baha'u'llah when his son Mirza Mehdi fell through the skylight as he was chanting his evening prayers, and gave up his life as a sacrifice, that those, as atonement, as it were, that those who had not been privileged to see Baha'u'llah might be able to see him again. And you can, I can go into that in more detail, but I'm sure most of you know that story. But it's so touching, the grief that he felt, and in the prayer that he reveals about that event. So they do feel, even though they are of another station, another level of ontology, they do feel pain, they do feel sorrow, they get sick. We know that Baha'u'llah, of course, was poisoned, and as a result of that, his hand quivered, shook the rest of his life. We even see that in the tablets he wrote after that. You can see the shaking handwriting as opposed to his beautiful calligraphy prior to that event. So the point is that they allow themselves the manifestations to be, they put themselves in the hand of destiny, if you will, knowing that whatever happens is the will of God, that it will be made correct. So if you remember, Christ, of course, has the power to avoid the crucifixion, but he knows it is important that he do so. And again, you can say, well, he wants to fulfill the prophecies of the 22nd Psalm, which describes his crucifixion in gruesome detail, as you remember way back when we read that. But it's hardly a contrivance on his part that he be crucified. And yet, without that crucifixion, in other words, when you ask any Christian, what is the most important thing Christ did, they will say that he died on the cross to save us from our sins. Well, you might argue that as a Baha'i, the most important thing he did was reveal what he revealed, so far as his teachings are concerned. And yet their life is also proof of who they are, even as the Bab could have avoided the execution. He had the power to do so. He had the opportunity to do so. And of course, he did so in a miraculous fashion when he was not ready. That's another proof of their power of their will. He was not through dictating his last instructions to his secretary, and until he was, they couldn't kill him, literally couldn't kill him. Okay, well, that's the class